See the best of Black storytelling come to life on the big screen at American Black Film Festival, June 14th through 18th in Miami Beach. Visit miamiandbeaches.com.
On this season of the Leading with Audacious Confidence podcast, we share stories from corporate executives and tips from those who coach them to high performance on what it really takes to build and keep your confidence in this fast-paced, ever-changing world of business, and how they inspire others to lead with confidence. Be ready to take lots of notes because there's always some juicy nuggets coming your way. Well, welcome once again to Leading with Audacious Confidence. I'm your host, Alicia Curry, and today is all about listening. So I hope you brought your listening ears because we have an amazing expert that's going to share so many wonderful tips for us on listening and share some stories about listening. And so let me share with you a little bit about Oscar, and then we're going to bring him on. Okay, so Oscar Trimboli is on a quest to create 100 million deep listeners. He is an author, host of the Apple award-winning podcast, Deep Listening, and a sought-after keynote speaker. He is passionate about using the gift of listening to bring positive change in homes, workplaces, and cultures worldwide. He has interviewed over 100 of the most diverse workplace listeners, including air traffic controllers, deaf and foreign language interpreters, hostage negotiators, and spies as part of researching world-class listeners. Over 14,000 people have contributed to this research about what gets in their way when it comes to listening. Oscar is a marketing and technology industry veteran working for Microsoft, PeopleSoft, Polycom, and Vodafone. He consults to American Express, AstraZeneca, Google, HSBC, Montblanc, PwC, Salesforce, Sanofi, and Siemens. Oscar loves his afternoon walks with his wife, Jenny, and their dog, Kilimanjaro. He will be playing Lego with one of his 4 grandchildren on the weekends. So welcome to the show, Oscar. I'm so excited to have you here.
G'day, Alicia. Looking forward to listening to your questions today.
So where in Australia are you?
I'm in Sydney, in Australia. I won the genetic lottery, the son of 2 first-generation migrants who moved from post-war Italy to Australia, and lived, loved, run, worked, done everything within 40 miles of where I'm standing right now. Although I've done a lot of international work, I was very lucky to be born where I was.
Oh, that's incredible. I loved my time in Australia. It's really shaped who I am today. So it's a beautiful country. Now, my very first question I wanted to ask was, how did you get started on this quest for deep listening?
I think like the Amazon, it kind of started with a drip, and then it started with a trickle, and then it moved into a stream, and then it moved into a small river, and then it moved into a big river, and then eventually, it's getting its momentum going. I think April 2008, I'm in a boardroom at Microsoft. We're setting the annual financial budgets for Australia with Singapore, our regional head office, and Seattle, our global head office. And the meeting was 90 minutes long. And at the 20-minute mark, my vice president, Tracy, in the room said to me, "Oscar, we need to see you immediately after this meeting. That's the equivalent of, honey, we need to talk." So honestly, from that point on in the meeting, I didn't listen to anything. The only thing I was listening to was getting a piece of paper and trying to figure out how many weeks of salary I had left. Tracy had never said that to me before. And the meeting miraculously finished a little early, finished at the 70-minute mark. And as everybody left the room, Tracy asked me to close the door. And as I walked back from closing the door, she said, "You have no idea what you did at the 20-minute mark, do you?" And I thought, great. I'm getting fired and I don't even know why. So as I sat down and prepared for the inevitable, Tracy said to me, if you could code how you listen, you could change the world. And as profound a moment of listening as that was on her behalf, in my head, in my mind, the only thing going through my head was, woohoo, I haven't been fired. So I guess one of the lessons from that is no matter what you say to somebody else, they're already interpreting and they're making their own meaning from that when they're listening if they don't have the full context. But wind the clock forward 2 weeks later, Brian, our financial controller, asked me to come into a budget setting meeting for Australia and asked me to audit his listening. And I realized as I sat and watched him for the next 90 minutes in that budget meeting, as I wrote down, gee, he asks triple barrel questions. Wow, he's only hearing from a handful of people in the meeting. Gee, he cuts certain people off and certain people speak up. I realized I'd started to code how to listen and wind the clock forward to today. We've got 27,000 people in a research database who've told us what's getting in their way when it comes to listening. So we've started to code things. We've coded a jigsaw puzzle game. We've coded practice cards for people. We've coded 3 books, and that's where we are today.
Wow. From getting fired to creating this massive movement. How amazing. In just 15 years. That's incredible. So I was sitting on a plane reading your book, and the gentleman next to me, he saw the title. He's like, huh. And I remember you sent me an email asking, well, why don't you ask the audience? Because I want to serve the audience. So I asked him, Andrew, so if you're listening, because he said you listened to the podcast, this is for you. So I'm asking right off the bat. He asked me, he's like, how do you not let your mind wander and you can stay engaged while someone else is talking? And I'm going to also kind of adjunct to this question, the 125, 400, and 900. So you can decode what the 125, 400, and 900 in the answer to that question.
All right. So thanks, Andrew. The good listeners get distracted and great listeners know when they're distracted and get back in the conversation. You can't stop distraction. Distraction is inevitable. And when we talk about the numbers you've just mentioned, you'll understand the science that sits behind that. Your job when you're listening is not to be so tough on yourself to go, oh, I'm a terrible listener, I got distracted. That doesn't make you a terrible listener. It just makes you a human. Mm-hmm. So be kind to yourself, Andrew. Here's a couple of things that most people don't understand about listening that may help you notice your distraction quicker, which will keep you in the conversation longer. You will not stop distraction. You just need to learn to dance with it a little bit better. The first thing is when it comes to listening, everybody thinks that focusing on the speaker is where you start to listen. And that's interesting, but it's a false premise. The first person you need to listen to is you. And for many of us, you don't prepare for listening. You just turn up with many browser tabs open in your mind, taking over your working memory. You don't have the space to listen, and distraction will have a bigger impact on you when you don't shut down those browser tabs. Whether you're a rock band, whether you are an orchestra, every professional musician, whether they played in the same room on the same day with the same music, with the same band, with the same instrument, they show respect to the audience. They show respect to the fellow musicians and the conductors, if it's a band, if it's an orchestra, and tune their instrument for between 3 and 5 minutes before they go into a performance. It's a sign of respect. It's a sign of professionalism. And it's an acknowledgement that you are now preparing for a performance. So the first thing I would say, Andrew, is notice what you're doing immediately before you're going into that conversation. Let me give you 3 simple tips and a bonus. If you can make these into a ritual, it's great. What I'm about to say is very easy to do, yet it's difficult to practice. So here are the 3 tips. Number 1, manage your electronic notifications. Now, we can't switch them off all the time. Some of us are in medical emergency room situations. Some of us are production supervisors who need to be on call all the time. I'm saying manage your notifications. Be conscious of them. Use the technology. Don't let the technology use you. Tip number 2, drink a glass of water before you go into every conversation. That will send a signal to the part of the body around the heart and the lungs known as the parasympathetic nervous system that'll just say, relax. And if you're listening to this right now and you take a drink of water, you'll notice, if you're very conscious of what's happening with your body, as that water goes down, all of a sudden something starts to calm down for you. And what it's doing is helping to shut down those browser tabs in your own mind. And tip number 3, 3 deep breaths. In through the nose, down to the bottom of the lungs and the diaphragm, and then out through the mouth. Now, those 3 tips, very easy to say, very difficult to practice. Our deep listening ambassador community, those people on a quest to create 100 million deep listeners in the world, say that's the order you should do it in. If you can manage your notifications first, then focus on your water, then focus on your breathing. That's the sequence to do it in. That's the highest yield returns you can make. Now, I'll let you into a dirty little secret. While we were recording the introduction, Alicia's phone rang. And she was completely distracted for that moment. And that's a very simple example of use the technology, don't let the technology use you. Now, I'm not judging her. I'm simply pointing out that most of us are unconscious about when these notifications can take place. Whether you're on an iPhone or an Android or Mac or a PC, there's one button in every operating system that will turn those beeps and buzzers off automatically for you when you're in a meeting. As long as you've got that meeting in your schedule, of course. So they're the 3 tips. For bonus, if you have time, play a song or music for 3 to 5 minutes, and that will completely rewire your mind and recharge your listening batteries. It's like the Tesla supercharger station. It will get your listening battery fired up and move from red or orange or touching on black all the way up to green and be charged, ready to listen. So now, Andrew, with those things in place, let me tell you what's going on while the conversation is happening. But before I do, I just want to pause and check in with Alicia. Any questions you've got about that?
Okay, so one of the things that he did mention to me was always thinking about my response while someone else is speaking, which is part of the distraction. It's like I'm thinking about my response while they're speaking, so I'm not sure I'm listening well.
And that may or may not be your job in the conversation. Here's the next tip. If you ask this question at the beginning of the conversation, listening moves from a battle for your attention, whether you're giving or paying attention in that conversation, whether you're providing an answer or a solution or just merely listening. If you ask this question, we know your meetings will be shorter. The person you're speaking to will say not just what they say the first time, but they'll say what they think and what they mean. If you ask this question, the conversation will have a listening compass to guide you, them, and the conversation, so your distraction is set not by you and your response, but by the purpose of the conversation. Now, Alicia will smile because she's just heard this question. And the question is, what will make this a great conversation?
Mm-hmm.
With that in place, your job as a listener is to listen to their response, because they may not want your response, Andrew.
Mm-hmm. So true.
A lot of people, a lot of people think listening is solving. A lot of people think listening is therapy. Listening is like comedy, dancing, and sex. The value is with the other person, not with you. So as a comedian, your joke doesn't work by itself. You need an audience. And well, you can dance alone, but it's much more fun to dance together. And you're moving together in a rhythm that's set by the music. And you're moving together and you're adjusting accordingly. And the value of the experience is created together. It's not that one is more dominant than the other. We'll get to the third thing a little bit later on in the conversation. So, Andrew, the first thing you have to ask yourself is, do they want you to solve anything? Do they want you to actually respond? Because some people just want the other person to create a container in which they can express their ideas. And let me give you those numbers in this context so you understand why we're saying this. A speaker will speak at between 125 and 150 words per minute. A speaker can think up to 9 times faster than what they can speak. They can think 9 times faster than what they can speak. That means that the very first thing they say is 14% of what they think and what they mean. Andrew, if you're thinking up a response, a reply, an answer, a solution to the 14%, you've missed 86% where they haven't had a chance to explain what they really think and what they really mean. A good listener listens to what people say. Great listeners notice what's not said. More is not said in a conversation than is said. Great listeners create a space for people to explore the gap.
Wow. That's huge. That is huge.
What's going through your mind as you hear that?
Sometimes when I'm having these conversations with guests and I want to ask a question and I'm like, I have like 3 questions in my head right now battling which one wants to come out first. So I resonate very, very strongly with that. You're thinking 9 times faster than you can actually speak, because sometimes my words try to come out and it's like, wait a second, let me just pause for a minute and really think about the question that I need to ask in this moment. So I resonate with that very, very much. And then the listening for what isn't said, like giving that space and that opportunity to really hear what's not said than what is said, because there's that 86% that isn't being actually, that aren't words, but it's being communicated in other ways.
Yeah, and you don't want to hear all 86% either, you know. For me, one of that 86% is, am I going to have Vegemite on toast for breakfast this morning? Or am I going to have a cup of tea with that? Am I going to walk the dog first? Am I going to feed the birds? You know, that's probably that part of the 86% is not interesting. But we can play a little game. So you've got 3 questions that are exploding in your head. So here's the real question for you, Alicia. Are they your questions, or are they the questions you think the audience would want us to have answered?
Oh, not in this particular instance at the moment, but I can't guarantee it's not going to happen at some point. But yeah, a lot of times it's a combination of both. It's like, what is the question that's really going to serve this interview? And then what am I really curious about, you know, and making the choice between what I'm curious about and what's better content for those who are listening. So,
yeah. And again, back for Andrew is the following. Write down or make a note of your question before you say it. if you've been asked to ask questions.
Mm-hmm.
And the second thing is, as you look at the question you've represented in writing, ask yourself, is that question a question for you? Is it a question for them? Or is it a question to progress the conversation? Typically, we ask questions so we can understand more. And that may be relevant sometimes, but mostly it's not. The next question is it a question for them? It's more helpful, but the third position. So there's always a third person, even if there's only two people in a dialogue, and the third person is the dialogue. Most people don't realize the conversation taking place has an energy and a momentum and a direction all of itself. Now, it's not our job as the listener to control that. We go back to the question we ask at the beginning, what will make this a good conversation? And that's the question we want to think about. Is this question serving that purpose, whatever that purpose is?
Mm.
When we do that, conversations paradoxically are shorter. The relationship is stronger because they're saying what they think and what they mean. So I have this thing called dyscalculus, which means I have a weird relationship with numbers.
Me too. Me.
Hi. It makes nice to meet you. So, when I say 3 is half of 8, people are very confused. And a lot of people listen for similarity rather than listen for similarity and difference. So when I say 3 is half of 8, they immediately go, oh my goodness, he's misspoken, he's wrong, he's confused. 3 is not half of 8.
4 is half of 8.
At least 4 is half of 8. I could also say 0 is half of 8. And in all 3 cases, we are correct if we listen to what I mean. Now, what you did when you said 4 is half of 8, you're thinking in math. And when I said 3 is half of 8, I'm thinking in geometry. If you look at the figure 8 and you bisect it vertically and you separate it, there are 2 3s there. If you turn the 8 and you bisect it in the center, there's 2 0s there. Now, for many of us, whether that's at work or at home, when somebody says something that doesn't make sense with our education, our cultural background, our family upbringing, we immediately spring into, no, our pattern says 4 is half of 8, therefore Oscar is wrong. Not what he said is incorrect, or, I'm curious.
Why did you say that?
Well, it's not even why did I say that. I'm just curious because it's different to the way I've discovered the world. If you work in industries and environments where you need to collaborate, where resources are tight, where there's competition, where customers are demanding, you're going to have a 3 is half of 8 moment pretty much every conversation. And my invitation to you is to simply notice, when do I jump to judgment to go, that's not my reality, that's not my experience? Can I just be curious just a little longer and understand what they mean by that rather than what they said by that? If you just take a little bit of extra time, you would have discovered that I was talking in geometry rather than arithmetic.
Is that why you say, tell me more?
That could be a reason we say, tell me more. And tell me more is one of the 3 questions I invite you all to build some muscles around in a conversation to explore what's not said. 3 questions are, tell me more, which is a north-south question. This is a question designed to keep the conversation going the same direction, and you're listening for the similar rather than the different. There's another smaller question you can ask, which is called, and what else? Now, that's the base question. If I was asking that, I'll go, oh, wow, is there anything else you've considered? And this is designed to be an east-west question. This is flipping the direction of the conversation 180 degrees to get people to listen differently and speak differently. Another dirty little secret of listening is good listeners hear people's draft thoughts. Great listeners hear their ultimate meaning, and they change the way a speaker communicates their idea. Typically, when you do this well, rather than talking in circles or talking in a way that isn't necessarily coherent to you, they'll slow down, they'll be more deliberate, and their ideas will make sense first to them and then to you. So we want to help the speaker move and go in that direction, north-south. And we want them to go east-west, because then we've fully explored what is that 86% in their mind, Alicia. And when we do, all of a sudden we hear what matters to them. Now, the third phrase is tiny. Listen carefully for this one. You may miss it. Here it is. Now, don't worry, nothing froze or hung or anything like that. If you spell the word listen and you reorganize those exact same letters, they spell the word silent. Silent and listen share the same letters. And if you can help yourself by shutting down those browser tabs and just pausing a little longer, the speaker will fill that space and help you understand what they mean. And then you can come to common understanding much, much faster. So if you want 3 really useful phrases after you've asked what would make this a great conversation, tell me more and what else, and then just silent.
Wow. Okay. So here we go again with the multiple questions in my head. People who are trained, like lawyers specifically, I'm going to talk about, who are trained to argue. They're trained to win an argument. How does, and you mentioned the ego in your book. I didn't even show everybody your book, How to Listen. This is the book. The ego, you talked about the ego getting in the way of listening. But when someone's trained, is that an ego situation? Like, how can they improve their listening and not be combative or argumentative in every area of their life? You're trained to do this in work, but then it comes out in every other area.
Well, it's back to that simple intention at the beginning of a conversation. What will make this a great conversation? So not what will make this a great conversation for you, Alicia, but what will make it a great conversation, meaning you, me, and the dialogue. It's about that intention. And the speaker has a responsibility too. If that's your role, you can say to your lawyer friend, I don't want anything solved in this conversation. I don't want any solutions. For the next 5 minutes, can you just listen to what I have to say completely uninterrupted? And they will. Because one thing lawyers follow is protocol. When you think about the concept of historical precedent in law, it's a protocol that they respect. Not enough of us have a conversation about how to have a conversation. We just get into the what, we get into the content, and we dialogue away. If you can just spend 5% of your time discussing how to discuss anything, it will be liberating, not just for you, but for others as well. Let me be clear, listening I'm talking about is commercial workplace listening. It is not therapy. If you want therapy, go get therapy. But the listening I'm talking about is making progress on a dialogue to a commercial outcome. And in the public sector, that may be a policy outcome in that context as well. So whether you're the person who's adopting the position of listener or speaker, be clear on the role you would like to play and the outcome and the process through which you go through that in. Now, if you're going to a bar on a Friday night, don't use these rules. Just be human and enjoy yourself.
This isn't workplace.
But if you do have an overbearing friend who's just come out of a week in court and all kinds of litigation and disputes, just be clear. It's like, hey, I want to complain about something today, but I don't want you to solve it. I don't want you to anticipate there's a class action in it for you or anything like that. I just want you to listen for the next 5 minutes. And I will say, I'm finished now. So it's finished, right?
We're not going to keep doing this all night long.
Yeah. So I think whether it's a lawyer, whether it's an accountant, whether it's an actuary, whether it's a human resources professional, everybody has a professional bias that they bring to a conversation, and that's what we've coded into the listening quiz that people can take. It's a 7-minute quiz. They can answer 20 questions, and we tell them what gets in the way when it comes to their listening, whether people are classic interrupters or they're classic problem solvers or they're classic hijackers of the conversation where they move the spotlight from the person speaking onto themselves, or they're just lost in the conversation. You can do that too. So again, it's about setting up the how, Alicia, rather than let's just chat. So how do you think the lawyers in your life would respond to that?
Well, I don't know. Someone was actually asking me about that, about being trained, when you're trained to respond argumentatively. It doesn't matter what I might say the sky is blue, and you're automatically trained to rebut what I'm saying. So that's why that came into like, how much of that is ego that plays into that, and how much of that is when they're actually trained to do that.
Look, ego plays an important role. It protects us. But when our ego takes over unconsciously and we're not conscious of the impact of our ego, that can happen. A trained lawyer, their purpose is not to rebut. That is not their purpose. Their purpose is to I've interviewed high court judges. Their purpose is to get an outcome for the person they're representing. Now, if all you do is rebuttal all the time, I'm not sure how successful you're going to be, because you're going to miss a lot of things when you're busy rebutting. You're going to miss a lot of what isn't said because you're too busy trying to rebut the first 14% of what they say.
Mm-hmm.
So again, my invitation to you who are trained in adversarial dialogue, and the mediators who are listening to this will say, you need to create a container for the truth to emerge as much as to rebut.
Okay, so I have another audience question. It's from Greg on LinkedIn. So Greg says, Greg is a coach, and he wanted to know that when he's coaching with a client, we talked about interrupting earlier. You mentioned interrupting. When he's with a client and he can hear them going down a path that's not helpful, it might be destructive, and he wants to interrupt that negative sabotage pattern that they're going into. When is it good to interrupt, and when should you not interrupt someone?
Yeah, and for those of you on LinkedIn, I put a lengthy post there for Greg with some recordings as well, so there's some additional assets for him. And please don't assume that interruption is bad. Interruption is just another dialogue technique we have in our kit bag of having a conversation. In Eastern Europe and in South America, talking over the top of each other is actually a sign of a really strong relationship. So this is cultural, it's contextual as well. When not to interrupt somebody, when they're mid-sentence, when they're mid-breath, when they're mid-thought, that's not the time to cut them off. Wait for the gap, wait for the pause. Yet, if you haven't set up this container, Greg, which is what will make this a great conversation, you miss the opportunity to skillfully, elegantly, and professionally interrupt. When you ask that question at the beginning, it becomes the compass setting for you and the other person who's going into a downward spiral, back into pathological outcomes or things like that. You can check in at the end of a breath, or you can check in every 10 to 15 minutes and simply say, Greg, at the beginning of the conversation, you said this will be a great outcome. I just want to check in. Is this story getting us there? Because sometimes we're quick to judge. The reason they tell those downward spiral stories over and 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 over again is because they haven't been heard when they tell that story. The only reason people are repeating these stories is they don't feel anybody has heard what they think and what they mean, what's in their head and in their heart. If you do that, people will put a completely different meaning on the story. So, Greg, there are times that interruption is crucial if it's aligned to the question, what will make this a good conversation? If you think the dialogue is moving away from that, that is helpful. Now, remember, they said it. You're not making the judgment. You're simply putting a mirror up to them saying, you said this, how's this story helping that? So it's not your job to judge it and say it's unhelpful or any of the other adjectives in that. Have a different relationship with interruption. Professor David Clutterbuck, which is one of the interviews I conducted, talked about the importance of impatience in dialogue, because sometimes being impatient can be the most productive thing for the other person in the conversation as well. Yet without that question right up front, what will make this a good conversation? You don't have permission to interrupt elegantly, professionally, and skillfully.
So when we're, I had a question, and then now I'm thinking about the scenario that I read in the book, and it actually happened to me as well. But before I get to that scenario, I did want to ask, what do leaders get wrong in your professional experience, having worked with so many of them? What do they get wrong when it comes to communicating with their team or listening to their direct reports? What do you see as a pattern that happens?
Rather, I call it unproductive. I don't think it's wrong. I think we need to be careful with the right and wrong labels. I think that's too easy to judge. I think where the work is, where the highest yield return is, most leaders are listening for similarity, and where they can improve is by exploring difference. So if you are an engineer who's been trained, you are trained in rational, sequential, evidence-based mindsets. So when you hear somebody say something that doesn't fit in that pattern, most leaders will try and drag that person into this way of thinking, as opposed to, let me fully explore where they're going with this. Let me ask some questions that contextualize this a little bit more. So rather than just jumping to conclusions that go, oh, this conversation's a waste of time, I can solve it pretty quickly, which is what a lot of leaders do because they think they're time poor. some questions that are going to help that speaker when we're exploring difference is, hey, if our competitor heard what we were saying right now, which bit do you think they'd be really worried about? If our competitor heard this conversation right now, what would they giggle and laugh about? Or if a regulator heard this, or if the government heard this, or if the media heard this, we're trying to get them outside and exploring different contexts. If we were in a different country and somebody heard this, and then all of a sudden the leaders are starting to listen differently, and they are helping the speaker to say the idea in a different way as well. So my invitation to leaders is, whether you're a lawyer, whether you're an engineer, even a doctor, you're all trained to pattern match. And that will only get you so far. That will work really well in predictable sequential systems, but most of us are dealing with dynamic, fluid, and organic systems the more senior we are, and the more critical it is for us to listen differently.
This conversation can go on and on and on. I'm like, tell us the difference between deep listening and active listening. And I also wanted to know when, like, we've been trained to say back what someone said, to almost, I guess, show that we've heard what they've said. So that, the technique of repeating what someone else said, how does that fit into all of this as well? So deep listening versus active listening, and kind of repeating what you said as a way of proving that I did hear you.
So what you've asked me to answer is, this term paraphrasing, but can we just take a quick commercial break for leaders asking questions? When you ask a question, ask one at a time with that person that you're working with. And then the reason you're asking one at a time, the answer they may provide a different context for you to ask the second question. So my first question back is simply this: you've asked me two questions. Which question would you like me to prioritize first?
Deep listening versus active listening.
Very simply, active listening, listening to what people say the first time. Deep listening, listening to what people haven't said.
Gotcha.
Second one, paraphrasing. A lot of people will say words like, what I heard you say is, or what I understood you say is. And that's your point of view. That's not what they said. To be effective, paraphrasing should be neutral and it should be short. So if you're trying to paraphrase somebody who's just spoken for 40 words, the likelihood you will accurately paraphrase the 40 words is zero. Mm-hmm. Let me bring you into a boardroom where I was working with a client, lovely lady, very polished English accent. She led a very substantial professional services firm. And she said, I am so frustrated with the public sector division. They're always anemic in their growth. They're always the most difficult to work with. They're always the most costly to bid on. And I simply said, always? Now I'm paraphrasing the point she was making, not the whole dialogue. And when you're a great leader, you'll listen for these phrases called absolutes. So these are phrases like always, never, precisely, exactly. When people give you these code words, what they're telling you is, this is the edge of my thinking. It's the edge of my mental model. I can't experience the world beyond that, so I put these phrases around it. You'll hear children say this all the time when they're arguing with their parents, for example. You always make me do that, mummy, and phrases like
you
that.
Never let me go.
Exactly. So back in the room, As I said the word always, she paused. She looked up in the corner of the room, and she was like a machine gun up until that point. The way she was talking was so fast, and she just paused. She looked up and she said to me, well, not always. I said, are you open to playing a game? She said, no. I was like, okay. Are you open to an experiment? Oh, yes, of course. She's very much of an evidence background. So I said, let's do an experiment. Imagine all those customers from the public sector that you're very, very frustrated with, and line them up in a room from left to right, with the ones that grow the most and are easiest to deal with at one end of the room, and the ones that frustrate you the most at the other end of the room. She goes, okay, I can do that experiment. I said, are the ones on the left always like the ones on the right? And she said, no, well, not always. I said, okay, so what are the ones on the left that grow a little bit more? And she said, well, they're more commercial, they're more deliberate, they act more like a commercial organization than a public sector organization. And then you could see there's a light bulb go on above her head. And she said, they shouldn't even be in our public sector business unit, should they? I said, I don't know. And she said, well, I'm going to go and reorganize this. And I said, oh, okay, well, maybe have a chat to your team before you do that. But wind the clock forward 12 months later, they move only 4% of the customers out of this group into a different group. And they see phenomenally more growth in that group because they started to treat them like commercial customers rather than public sector customers, because we heard the word always in a conversation. So back to the question about paraphrasing. Paraphrasing should be neutral, should be relevant, and should pick out the essence. It usually is an adjective, a descriptive word. I was working with a group of engineers where they described the project as the never-ending project, the political project, all these wonderful adjectives that sat around that. And we played an interesting experiment with them as well. Just paraphrasing. Alicia, could you pass me the salt? Oscar, did you just ask me to pass you the salt? It's very performative.
Mm-hmm.
It has its place when you're early in a relationship and you're trying to create some kind of rapport, but use it carefully, because in a lot of cases, people paraphrase their interpretation, not what the person actually said. And for them to feel heard, they need to hear back literally their own words. Make it safe for you. Just pick out one or two words.
So that makes me think about the case in the book that you talked about, where this person went to the doctor and was hoping not to hear the words. She was hoping to hear benign, hoping to hear that it wasn't cancerous, and sitting there, and then the doctor says that it is cancer and goes on a complete process of what comes next without taking that moment to even recognize if it's landed with her, what does she need in that moment, without expressing empathy in that moment. And so a similar situation happened with me, where it wasn't the diagnosis, because I had gotten the diagnosis beforehand. It was going to the surgeon, and now everything that the surgeon was expressing to me was all on her schedule, on her, timeline, on her, what you need to do next, because my schedule is this, and because I need you to do this, and because it was all about her and nothing about what I was experiencing. And because I was sitting there and not really responding, she kept saying, you do realize that you have cancer. You do realize this. and we need to move now. We need to move quickly. And I took the minute and I said, I need to process this. I need to digest this. I'll let you know. And I found someone else to work with. But this thing of, and I've spoken to a lot of women who have had this incident where they felt rushed into surgery. They felt rushed into then radiation, and they felt rushed into doing all these things because the doctor was just putting them on their timeline and not giving them and even when it's aggressive, you still need a minute. Like a minute is not going to change something if you take a minute and just recognize where I am in the conversation before you continue down the path of telling me what to do next.
Yeah. And when we talk about the example of that language, you do realize you have cancer. Actually, no, you don't. You have a cancer diagnosis.
That's what I just told her, actually. I said, I understand the diagnosis.
Yeah. And for a lot of medical professionals, they need to be careful to make the illness the person. If they're not conscious of the language, that's what they do. And they don't help the patient become part of their own solution. So in all those cases, and I've interviewed a number of medical leaders and trainers that say one of the things they do is make sure that when they do that, they're actually pointing to an image and pointing to the image, explaining that is the problem. Otherwise, the human thinks they're the problem.
Mm.
And when you communicate and listen in that way, the patient becomes part of their own recovery much faster. But as you pointed out, until they've had time to make sense of what they've heard, a good doctor, a good specialist, a nurse will check in. And the first check-in question is, what do you want to get out of this consultation today? Because a lot of times it's got nothing to do with the this and the that and the booking and the radiation and all of those things. They're very mechanical. They're not listening in any way whatsoever. As really interesting research says that it only takes 43 seconds before a medical practitioner will interrupt a patient when they say what they say. The very first time when they turn up, what brings you here today? Off they go, and within 43 seconds, right, I know what to do. Off we go. The flip side, I've just interviewed a wonderful doctor in England, and she had to, in her early career, tell a wife that her husband had died of cardiac arrest, a heart attack at work, and they couldn't resuscitate him. And she got punched in the face by a 65-year-old woman who was the wife, and she didn't realize why. She didn't understand it, but she understood why later on. And for many of us, if we don't listen carefully to people dealing with significant change in their life, you're going to get punched in the face. Literally or metaphorically. In this case, you metaphorically punched the surgeon in the face because you took your disease somewhere else. You picked somebody else who would listen.
Correct. Absolutely. And so I really resonated with that story in the book because I experienced it, and I'm not the only one who has experienced that. I know other women have as well. And so the work that you're doing is essential. It's vital. It's needed in every area, no matter what field you're in, because listening is an opportunity to grow, develop, and work smarter and better together as teams, as leaders. So it is, and it can be the difference between life and death, as you've, shared with us. Can you share with us, as we're coming to a close, the 3-minute exercise? Because I did it. I was on my way to do a training with a leadership team. And before we did our training, I actually implemented the 3-minute exercise where we breathe, notice our thoughts. Can you talk about that a little bit and the purpose and the power in it?
Well, I'll do you a deal. I'll tell the story if you tell us what you think happened differently for that group as a result of doing this exercise. So it's a version of the tuning exercise. It's tune into yourself before you go into a conversation. And it's simply just, it's a control shutdown, visually, verbally, viscerally. You just want to be connected to your body and then ask yourself for a period of 3 minutes, what am I not listening to? Now, in your context, it was probably, what am I not listening to in this group? But it equally could have been, what am I not listening to in myself or the person who was hosting you for that meeting? And the purpose of it is to bring our consciousness to ourselves so we can create space for the conversation to land in a productive way, rather than just a pool table where you hit the white ball and all the balls go scattered and everything bounces around. We want to be a little bit more present so we can notice body language signals. We can notice who's talking and who's not. We can notice not just what's said, but how it's said as well. And when we bring this consciousness, because we need to understand listening is a full body experience. Active listening is done with your eyes and your ears. Deep listening is done with your full body. And when I interviewed Dr. Evelyn and her work, she's completely deaf and an amazing percussionist. She takes her shoes off when she performs so she can feel the entire vibrations of not just the instrument, but the room and the audience as well. Evelyn Glennie, in that case, taught me that listening is being present to yourself first and then being present to what's happening all around us. When we do this, we literally change the way the group performs. How did it change the group performance for you?
I'll tell you, this was the first time I was with this group, and I knew from before that there were some conflict issues, and everyone in the room, I felt like there was a calm in the room. Like people were really paying attention to what was going on, because I framed it from the beginning that you are going to be distracted. Your mind is going to wander. Don't try to stop it from wandering. Just notice when it's wandering and then bring it back. Just be present enough to recognize when you start thinking about what's for lunch, what are they doing over in the machine shop, what is happening over there, and just bring it back to present where we are today, right now, what we're trying to accomplish. And a really interesting thing happened is, so we were using Kolbe. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Kolbe strengths, but we were talking about Kolbe, and we were about to do during the training, we were about to do a physical challenge with them, a game. We were going to play a physical game. And just before that, I was showing them, certain people's strengths. And I said, if you need them to build anything, these are the people you call on. If you need them to physically build anything, these are the people you call on. And then I segued into, this is what we're going to do. And we're going to be building this stuff, and whoever builds fastest wins. it's a competition, and then there were two teams, and the team leaders were choosing the members of their team. And one person, she chose all these particular people. And at the end of the task, they won. So I asked her, why did you choose them to be on your team? And she said, because right before you told us what we were doing, you said, if we wanted anybody to build, choose these people. And then we went in and you said, we're going to be building something. So these were the people that I chose first. He said, oh, you were listening to me. She's like, yeah. And the other group said, oh, yeah, we missed that completely. Said, we didn't hear that. I said, there you go. That's what listening, when you listen. She listened and she took action on what it is I said. So that was interesting, and they won.
Well done. Well done. Thanks for experimenting with the idea and showing how it can create completely different performance in groups.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I usually have a series of rapid fire questions, but this has been such a great conversation that I want to leave it there. And I want to just make sure that we have all the resources. So your book, we're going to put it on a slide at the end of this podcast. Your book, we have the playing cards, these wonderful playing cards that you sent me. I don't deep listening. And just as we're wrapping up, tell us, what's the best use of these playing cards?
Well, the practice cards, you can use them by yourself, you can use them in pairs, you can use them in training exercises, you can use them in groups. They've been used in prisons, they've been used by school principals, they've been used by bank tellers, they've been used by pharmaceutical executives. Each card has got on one side of the card a concept that you might choose to practice, and on the back of the card you might choose to explore the question on the back of the card. That may be a question for yourself, or it may be a question for the person you're in a conversation with. We recommend that you use the card for a period of 1 to 3 weeks, so you consolidate the learning on that. The cards are organized into the 5 levels of listening, which we haven't even touched on today.
I know, and I wanted to ask you on that too.
Of listening. We'll come back another time and do that. Yes. The cards are organized in a way based on the evidence in our database about what gets in people's way. The majority of the cards are organized at level 1 and level 2. I would recommend pick a card from level 1 that you kind of go, yeah, I could work on that, and work on that for 1, 2, 3 weeks. Show it to somebody you trust and say, hey, I'm working on this in my listening. Hey, point out when I'm doing that well. Hey, highlight when I may not have done that as well as I could have. So that's a simple way to use the listening cards in action.
And it'll be fun to do as a family.
Yeah, just remember all of this is research for workplaces. Please don't use this in any family context. I don't want any people saying they got divorced because they listen. And
yes, it's for work context, but with your kids, if you have teenagers, might be helpful to you.
It will. Teenage boys listen very differently to teenage girls. Teenage boys communicate very differently from teenage girls as well. So
we didn't get into the gender, we didn't get into the culture, we didn't get into the 5 levels of listening. There's so much.
Yeah, so the most practical step for everybody is simply this: visit listeningquiz.com and take the 7-minute listening quiz. Most people finish it in 4.5 minutes. You answer 20 questions, you get a 5-page report, tells you what your primary and secondary listening barriers are, and gives you 3 tailored tips based on that about what to practice for the next 90 days.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you so much, Oscar. I really, really appreciate it. And yes, we will have you come back and we'll talk about all the things we didn't get to touch on, because there's so much about listening that we need to know. We need to know these things so that we can have productive and profitable workplaces that are conflict, that we know how to handle conflict in a respectful way that's not creating more conflict, but we actually listen to one another and we hear what's not said more than what is said. So Thank you for your time. Thank you so much. Over in Sydney, Australia. Happy Saturday. It's Friday over here, but happy Saturday.
Thanks for listening.
You're welcome. So thank you so much for tuning in and listening to us. And I encourage you to go out there and lead yourself, lead your teams, and lead your organization with audacious confidence. Until next time, this is Alicia Curry and Oscar signing off. I'll talk to you next time. Bye.